topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Churchill said, "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it." Kevin Hallinan believes that certainly applies to business. Welcome to Winning Business Radio, here at W4CY Radio. That's W4CY.com. And now, your host, Kevin Hallinan.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining in today. Once again, I am Kevin Hallinan, and this is Winning Business TV and Radio on W4CY.com. We're streaming live on Talk4TV.com in addition to Facebook, and that's at Winning Business Radio. And of course, we're available in podcast after the live show on tons of outlets, including YouTube, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple, pretty much wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can get a sense of that list at winningbusinessradio.com. The mission of the show, as regular listeners know, is to offer insights and advice to help people avoid the mistakes of others, right? To learn best practices. Those are the how-tos, the what-tos, the what-not-tos. And I always say to be challenged and hopefully to be inspired by the successes of others. But, you know, virtually every successful person I've ever had a chance to talk to has had some form of failure in their lives and careers. So while we all have to get our knees skinned once in a while, I keep saying I'm driven to keep those scrapes from needing major surgery. Let's endeavor to learn from history so we don't repeat it. Today, my guest is Steve Pike. He's founder of Next Wave Community, veteran church planter, and author of Discovering the 21st Century Church, as well as the soon-to-be-released Next Wave Understanding the 21st Century Church. Here's his bio. Steve Pike serves as the catalyst for the Next Wave virtual community, an online community of church leaders committed to being with Jesus on his mission in the challenging 21st century context. He's also the president and founder of Urban Islands Project, a national collaborative organization dedicated to increasing the presence of the church in the core of America's urbanized communities. Additionally, Steve serves as an executive coach with Accelerate and is part of the coaching consulting team at the Answer Group. Prior to taking on his current responsibilities, Steve was the founding director of the Church Multiplication Network. CMN serves church multipliers to effectively equip, strategically fund, and innovatively network new faith communities in America. Since its formation in 2008, CMN has assisted with the starting of over 4,500 new congregations in every region of the U.S. Steve is the author of the soon-to-be-released book, The Reimagined Church, which is a follow-up to the bestseller Next Wave, Discovering the 21st Century Church, and author of Total Fitness for Your Church, and co-author with Dr. Tom Nebel, hope I said that correctly, Tom, of Leading Church Multiplication. Steve's passion for church multiplication began in 1989 when he and his wife, Cherry, pioneered a new church that became the catalyst of a church planting movement in the state of Utah that continues to this day. The Pikes make their home in Denver, Colorado. They're blessed to be the parents of Lindsay and Jeremy and the grandparents of Miles, Cohen, Wesley, James, and Amelia. When he's not working with church and nonprofit leaders, Steve enjoys outdoor adventures with his family in the grandeur of his home state of Colorado. Steve, welcome to Winning Business Radio and TV. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be with you today.
I hope I pronounced everything correctly.
Yeah, you were close enough. Nebel is how you say Tom's name.
Nebel. Okay. Sorry, Tom. Thank you. I'll get it right next time. So listen, before we get started, I'm sure there are some in the viewing and listening audiences that are thinking, hey, Kevin, this is a show about business, right? So business successes and challenges. Why do you have a Christian church guy in here? Well, it's a fair question, and I want to address it, and I want to hear your thoughts. A church is a community of believers. Okay, we get that. But a church also has business-related challenges like financial stability, growth, decline, marketing and messaging, leadership, and the list goes on, right? So even Jim Collins, we all know Good to Great, has a companion for nonprofits. It's a companion material for nonprofits. So as a Christ follower who spends a fair amount of time in church, quote, in church, and served on two boards for many years, I've seen those challenges firsthand. And when I first met Steve a couple of months ago in Boston, I knew I wanted him to share his insights and believe that many of the audience will get value. So you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've
All
you've
right,
covered it
that's
all.
fair. That's fair.
What do you want to know?
All right, so let's start with your background. Where'd you grow up? I knew home is Colorado, but whereabouts?
Yeah, if you followed my journey, you'd think I might be trying to stay one step above the law or ahead of the law. I was born in the state of Washington, kind of grew up in Oregon,
Ah,
went to high school in Ohio, got married and moved to Florida. I lived in Jersey. I lived in Utah. I lived in outside of Chicago. Now I'm in Denver, and Springfield,
yeah,
Missouri was another
yeah,
place. So
yep, yeah,
all over the place.
yep. So when you were young, kind of like coming up into high school, what were your early interests? What were you into?
Oh man, I wanted to be an astronaut.
No kidding.
That was yeah. So I was just a total nerd about anything having to do with space.
Yep.
Even even went so far as to apply to go to the Air Force Academy. I did some research and I felt that was the best way to become an astronaut
Mm,
was to go through that path. Um, and started down that path, and then I felt like God directed me in a different direction and got
yeah,
involved in ministry.
yeah. I think I would have enjoyed space. I mean, long story short, I didn't do well my first semester freshman in school. I figured it out the second, but I came back around Christmas and said to my dad, "I'm joining the Army." It was 79 post-Vietnam. He said, "Heck no, you're going back to school." So
Yeah.
I wish I had been in the military, but today I think I'd go into Space Force.
Yes. Yeah. I would too.
Yeah.
So,
So you chose Southeastern University in Florida and you focused on a ministerial degree.
yeah.
What was behind that or those decisions?
Well, that's a great question. The bottom line is, I actually felt like God directed me to go to Southeastern University,
Yeah.
and it was actually a surprise because as I said, I was actually in the process of going to the Air Force Academy. Really felt like that. I had already reached out to get the endorsements I needed and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. It's pretty far down the pathway toward that, and I just felt like God kind of interrupted that
Mm,
trajectory and sent me in the direction of Southeastern.
that's cool. That's cool. And you met your wife there.
I did.
So transition to tell us about your wife and your grown kids.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, my wife grew up in Florida, so she's one of the few people who actually were born and raised in Florida. Most
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
they call them snowbirds or,
Yeah.
imports or whatever.
Yeah. My brother,
Uh,
his kids, I'm telling you, even his kids didn't grow up there
no, yeah.
and live
But
there.
she actually did until I came along and then I took her everywhere else. But so she's an original Florida girl, and then we had two kids, Jeremy and Lindsay, and they are now married and they all have so they've given us grandkids,
Yeah.
which as some people say, grandkids are God's reward for not killing your kids when they were
Yes.
teenagers,
Agreed.
so
All right, so you started in I'm taking you back here, but we'll go we won't take too
Sure.
much time here, but I wanted people to hear kinda your career
Yeah.
progression. I
Yeah.
mean, how do you get to write a book about ministry and about church growth and have these secrets on not really secrets, but,
Yeah.
reveal what you've learned? Well, you started as many did or do still, I think I don't know as many do now, but as a youth pastor in Jacksonville.
Right.
Tell us a bit about that role and your most important takeaway from that first role.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great yeah, that was actually my second,
Okay,
youth pastorate position. My first one was in New Jersey,
okay.
which was kind of a culture shock, and that's actually the first place I learned something about the different
Mm,
sort of personalities of regions
mm,
of the country. I was going to school in Florida, but then we moved to New Jersey, and the culture was just really, really different. It was just different. I mean, it wasn't better or worse. It was just different. It was a interesting experience, and that taught me something about okay, if you're going to do business or
mm,
ministry somewhere, it's important to understand what people are like in that region of the country and just have a general understanding of that. Uh, Jacksonville was so the first church I was at was kind of a when I went there, I think there were, I don't know, 400 or 500 people part of the church, fairly good sized church.
mm.
But it grew to like 1,000 people while I was there in 2 years. It
Wow,
just blew up. And then
wow.
same thing happened in Florida. So I started to think that was normal. But one of the key things I learned in the church in Jacksonville was just how to really recognize what the leaders that I'm working under, what their priorities are,
Mm,
and
mm,
understand. I was a pretty young, smart aleck guy that thought I knew everything.
Yep.
I know that that doesn't characterize you or anybody else, but that
No, of
was
course
me.
not. Of course not.
And the pastor, at one point, I was sort of challenging some ideas that he had and trying to tell him how he was wrong about some stuff, and he basically just very gently and kindly pulled me aside and said, "Look, I'm the senior pastor. You're not. If it comes down to what I want and what you want, it's going to be what I want. That's just the way the world works. And until you figure that out, you're going to be pretty frustrated."
Mhm.
And that was an important lesson that I learned there. I think was just how to function in a. It was a
Yeah.
fairly, that church was started out around 500 and went to 1,500 while I was there.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
we had a lot of moving parts and things like that. So anyway, that was that lesson learned.
And then Naperville high school pastor.
Yeah, that was a really big church. That was, 2,500, 3,000
Wow.
people. Sort of, they call them
Multiple
a mega
services.
church. Yeah,
Yeah.
multiple services. I had 200 kids in my Sunday school class, in the
Wow.
youth group, or, we'd have a youth event, we'd have 1,000 kids show up and stuff
Wow.
like that. So it was a whole different ball game than anything I'd previously been part of. And, that was where I think I started to get a taste. A lot of the people, Naperville is a very strong, it's kind of a bedroom community of Chicago. And most of the people who live in Naperville were in the middle management to upper management of big companies and corporations and stuff based in Chicago. And so I found myself working with the kids of very high level leaders. And that was where I really first became introduced to, I guess, some of the complexities and the challenges of really leading a complicated, large organizations.
Yeah.
So that was that experience there for 4 years.
And you had some organizational structure, no doubt. You had either, I don't know what you
Yeah.
called them. We used to call ourselves youth staff or whatever. How many people did you have in your
Yeah,
organization?
yeah. Well, so the youth staff, there were three. There was a high school pastor, a college pastor, and junior high pastor. I was the high
Yep.
school pastor.
Yep.
And then, we all had everything we were paid, but then everybody else were volunteer.
Yeah.
But, I had I don't know, 25 or 30 volunteers that worked with me to pull that off, So again, I learned some stuff about working with volunteers and people who don't get paid anything. They don't have to show up. And so you have to learn how to help them be excited about what they're doing beyond just getting a paycheck, Yeah.
And is that right after that? Was that Ogden where you started? You planted
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're,
So let me just mention this for
Yes.
kind of a non-church person, many of whom are listening. Yeah, churches they're not always there. It might seem like it, some of the older buildings in churches, but no, churches have a beginning and a growth path, right? So yes, you started a church. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So we're, up to that point, I had been part of existing churches all my life, although I'd had some thoughts along the way about, wow, I think this is a place that needs a church. So that was kind of in me, but I didn't have, it wasn't time to pull the trigger on that. But at this point, 4 years into it, I really saw an opportunity and need for a new church to be started, of all places, in Ogden, Utah. It's a way too long of a story to explain how I concluded that, but you're right. I mean, churches, every church actually at some point had a beginning. I mean, they don't just always exist. And I think sometimes people do see these old buildings with moss grown on them and stuff, and we think, well, that's just always been here. But at some point, even the old buildings with moss were an idea in somebody's head, or a sense of calling. A pastor would say a sense of calling. Excuse me. And so we had this sense of calling to go start a church in Utah and help people there follow Jesus. And so we moved there. It was in church planning world, we call it a parachute drop. We just, parachuted out of the plane, metaphorically speaking. We had no visible means of support, except for we did raise some support from some churches and individuals who said, man, we think that this is something that is a good thing. We want to help you do that. And so we got some kind of monthly support to give us, to be able to put food on the table and, have a house over our head, or a roof over our head and stuff like that in the startup phase until the congregation formed. And so, it was off to the races, my first church planning experience.
Well, I have more questions about Ogden. But this time for our first break. We're going to be back in just about a minute, Steve. Everybody else, we'll be back with Steve Pike in about 60 seconds.
You're listening to Winning Business Radio with Kevin Hallinan on W4CY Radio. That's W4CY.com. Don't go away. More helpful information is coming right up, right here on Winning Business Radio.
Have you ever dreamt of being on the radio? Well, now is your chance. Be a radio show guest on the #1 ranked internet radio station and promote you and your business for free. Yes, you heard it, free. Business advertising right here on W4CY.com. Call 561-506-4031 now to get booked on one of our shows. That's 561-506-4031. Get your free advertising now.
And now back to Winning Business Radio with Kevin Hallinan, presenting exciting topics and expert guests with one goal in mind, to help you succeed in business. Here once again is Kevin Hallinan.
We're back with Steve Pike. He is the founder of Next Wave Community, veteran church planter, author of Discovering the 21st Century Church, as well as the soon-to-be-released Next Wave, Understanding the 21st Century Church. So, the Northeast, to me, the Northeast has, Catholic churches everywhere, some Baptist, right. Mostly Catholic churches. So for someone planting a church in the Northeast, most of the people you're reaching out to are Catholic, right?
Right.
Just their tradition.
Right.
In Ogden, it's LDS.
Right.
Was that a challenge? Okay.
Yeah. Well, definitely Utah and Ogden were not at the top of the church planners' favorite place to go list. So yes, most of the people, in fact, this actual statistics, I think were around 67 to 70% of the people would identify as members of the LDS church, or they would be friends of the LDS church. Probably about half of those were actually active people. And then the interesting thing about Utah is the other 29%. So you got about 30 or 70% LDS, 29%. Well, let me flip it around. 1% or less than 1% would identify as Christian.
Yeah.
And then about 29% would identify as very anti-religious.
That's fine.
So,
not just somewhat, but very.
We felt kind of like the story about the shoe salesman who arrives at a place, and there's two of them. They go to the same place, and one writes back after a week and he goes, "Man, I cannot sell any shoes here because nobody wears shoes."
I love this.
The other guy writes back and says, "This is awesome. I can sell shoes to everyone because nobody wears shoes." So, we decided to have the attitude of the second guy and say, okay, nobody's really interested in the church here, but there's people that are here that are people who they don't know it yet, but they would like to have a relationship with Jesus, and we want to help them find Jesus. So that was kind of our attitude. And incredibly enough, we saw that happen. We saw hundreds and hundreds of people become followers of Jesus over the years. And we helped start 5 other churches in Utah during that same decade.
Wow.
And that's where I kind of got bit with the church planting and church multiplication bug.
And what years were those?
That would have been the 90s, from basically the beginning of 1990 to the beginning of 2000. It was 10 years. Yeah.
So that seems to me to be pre kind of church planting, pre-ARC, pre all that.
Right. Yeah, there was towards the end of the 90s, that's when some of the more intentional things began to happen. There was actually a thing called the Church Multiplication Institute, I think was what it was called at the time. And a guy named Bob Logan created the Church Planners Toolkit. But that was all that stuff was created after we'd already started the church, So we just had to pray a lot and figure it out. And
that's incredible.
Again, by God's grace, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So then, if I'm following the timeline, you took a denominational or regional district level leadership role, director of church planting and development in Colorado. Tell us about
Right.
that role.
Yeah, yeah. So the way that the denomination was organized was Colorado and Utah were one region called the Rocky Mountain. At that time, it was called the Rocky Mountain District. Now we call it
Mhm.
the Rocky Mountain Network,
Yep.
whatever,
Yep.
just different, cooler names. But yeah, so I went. I'd lived in Ogden for 10 years, and then was approached by the district, and they said, "We'd like you to do for the whole district what you've been doing in Utah."
Mm.
And so we felt like that was the right thing for us to do. So yeah, we moved to Colorado Springs and worked from there and helped start churches throughout not just Utah but also Colorado. And that, again, what's happening for me as I make these different changes was, I mean, my goodness, Utah culture was dramatically different from the culture of Naperville that I came from, and then going to Colorado, you've got people on the plains that are ranchers and farmers and stuff. Then you have the Front Range, which is where Denver, and it's pretty urban, and all the problems of large cities you're going to find in Denver and some
Mhm.
of the large cities along the Front Range. Then you have the mountain communities, the resort communities, but then they call it the West Slope, like Rifle and Grand Junction. Everybody's got gun racks in the back of their pickups, and they're farmers and ranchers, and it's the Old West. And then you get to Utah, which is its own personal thing. So we had to, every time somebody said, "Hey, I want to plant a church," I had to think, okay, where do you feel like you're supposed to be going, and help them navigate the mega or the local cultural difference
Mm.
that they were going to experience, because planting a church in Denver is not the same as Yuma, which is way out on the Eastern Plains, and it's not the same as Vail or
Mm.
Grand Junction or Salt Lake City. So every place is a little different. So you can't just do the same thing every place and expect the same kind of results.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds familiar, in fact.
Yeah.
Then you moved into a national denominational leadership role. Actually,
Right.
3 roles, as I saw it, I think. So administrator, U.S. missions,
Yeah.
director of church planting and development, and then founding director of Church Multiplication Network, correct? Tell us about
Yeah.
those organizations
Well,
or
this is
roles.
where,
Roles.
yeah, this is where I had to learn how to navigate big organizations. This was a
Mm.
very complicated, large organization.
Yep.
The national office for this denomination had over 1,000 employees in that one building in Springfield, Missouri. So,
Mhm.
and we served almost 13,000 churches, 3 million constituents just in the United States. But then the American church also served as kind of the lead church for the entire world. And that this denomination had something at that time, I think about 60-70 million people worldwide, about 250,000 churches. So it's a really big, complicated, multi-layered organization. And I found myself so sort of yanked out of being in a small version of that to just being, all of a sudden, man, I've got all these. The language we used was publics. We have all these different publics we have to
Yep.
communicate with.
Yep. Yep. Constituents, publics. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and yes, but they're like, they're different layers of leaders, different responsibilities. We had to interact with all of them, and it was in the middle of all that milieu that I had to kind of figure out. I went there kind of a little bit confused as to I felt like I was supposed to be there. It was a great
Mm.
opportunity. But I felt like what I had a vision for was really going to be hard to pull off within the confines of a very established. At this point, that the organization about ready to celebrate its 100th anniversary,
Mm.
and churches are probably more stuck than any business ever gets when it comes to just honoring tradition and
Mhm.
keeping
Mhm.
things the same. Stasis is the way they tend to go, rather than, changing and flexing and stuff like that. And what I felt like needed to happen was some pretty radical restructuring. And so the bottom line is, I described my time there. I was there for 8.5 years, and I liken it to 4 levels of a video game. Where at each level you have to kind of, you win, you kill the dragon or whatever it is, and save the princess, and you get to go to the next level.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had to, so when I first got there, I had to kind of read reality of what I was facing and win that first version and so on all the way through. So in doing so, that's when I was actually able to start this organization within the organization called Church Multiplication Network, which gave the proper emphasis to starting new churches for this older organization. And it gave us a rallying place. It gave us an organizational hub. It gave us resources, all kinds of stuff to begin to really make that organization a welcome place for people who felt like they're supposed to start a church. We created a way for them. They could contact us and we can help you do this. You're not by yourself, and you have all this whole big organization behind you. And that's what I kind of did.
Coaching,
yes,
resources.
We sort of were able to focus all of the resources that were already part of the organization, as well as create some new resources to provide, coaching, training, funding. That was a big one. Funding.
Always is. Yep.
Assessing, just all that kind of stuff to help the planters be successful. That was at the end of the day, that's what we did.
Touch on assessing for a minute, because that's something we do as well in the business world a lot. Go ahead.
Well, what's interesting is the assessment tool that became very popular was actually came out of the business world. And it was based on behavioral interviewing, the concept of behavioral interviewing, which was, my understanding, very much part of the business world. And it was kind of a whole new thing. Your typical ministerial interview is more about people. They want to hear your heart for God and for God's calling and stuff, which is totally part of it, but it often overlooked what behavioral interviewing gets to is the competencies of a person. So
what development, not to say no to them, but to
no,
maybe, but really to talk about where the development opportunities are, right?
Exactly. And the way we get at that was actually, it was developed by this guy named Dr. Charles Ridley, who was a professor at that time. I think he was at the University of Indiana. He was a believer, but his job at the university was to basically formulate these assessment tools for business. And as he was doing that, he thought, this could be applied to church planting, because there's so many commonalities in terms of the startup things that are necessary in starting up a church. They're very similar to starting up a business. And so anyway, he did some research and created a profile that was predictive. If you did a proper behavioral interview, you could actually predict the effectiveness of an individual before they even started, based on their past behavior. And so that's something it's hard to do without skilled people leading those interviews. So I actually went and got trained how to do behavioral interviews, how to write them, how to develop them, how to interpret them, all that kind of stuff. And then we trained a whole fleet of people to do that within the denomination and within Church Multiplication Network. And so anybody that started a church for many years, and I think to some degree it's been modified as time has gone, but that is still the one of the root things that helps. What we wanted to do was stop sending people out on suicide missions that weren't really, they just didn't have the right wiring innately, or they just weren't ready. And this helped us have an objective way to figure that out. Yeah. And so I think we probably saved a lot of marriages and a lot of pain and suffering from well-intended, good-hearted people. And sometimes, like you said, it wasn't yes or no. It was more like not yet, or hey, go do this, for the next couple of years, then come back and you'll probably be ready, kind of stuff. So that really was helpful.
All right. So following the timeline, you then founded and still lead as CEO Urban Islands Project, which to me is fascinating. So tell us about that initiative and that organization. And we've got about a minute to start. We'll come back after this next break. So go ahead.
Okay. So bottom line is, working as I did, we started several thousand churches while I was in the leadership role. And I saw churches being started everywhere, but one of the places they weren't being started very much was in urban contexts, like in the city centers. And that bothered me. And I wondered about it. And at first I tried to fix it from inside where I was at. I thought, I'm the leader of this big national thing. I can do it. But I really felt like, man, it's going to require way more focus. And so I resigned my position and jumped out of again, did another parachute and started this idea of Urban Islands Project. I'll tell you, maybe not. I don't know when the break's coming up, so what I'm about to say might take more than 30 seconds.
We'll do it right here. Hold that thought. We're going to come right back to Urban Islands Project in about 1 minute.
Okay.
You're listening to Winning Business Radio with Kevin Hallinan on W4CY Radio. That's W4CY.com. Don't go away. More helpful information is coming right up, right here on Winning Business Radio.
The YP.com website is your local search engine. If you're looking for a good restaurant, it can help you find the right one nearby with ratings and reviews. Or if your car breaks down, you can use the YP app to find the closest repair shop. Or maybe you're just looking for something to do on a Friday night. Well, it has great local coupons for all sorts of things in your area. No matter what, when, or where, if you're looking for something, YP Local Search can help you find it. So go to YP.com or download the app to search local, find local, and save local.
And now back to Winning Business Radio with Kevin Hallinan, presenting exciting topics and expert guests with one goal in mind: to help you succeed in business. Here once again is Kevin Hallinan.
We're back with Steve Pike, who in the timeline we're discussing, CEO of Urban Islands Project. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Urban Islands Project was born out of, like, the first thing I did as I was in transition out of this national office. I did enough research, and I'd been around cities enough to figure out cities are like 1,000 islands smashed together. Mm-hmm. And so you take all this stuff I've learned about the different cultures of different places, and I realized in cities you can actually have, just from block to block even sometimes,
absolutely,
really, really, really different cultural realities. And so that was one of the reasons I realized that churches weren't often started in cities, because you come in there and you're trying to serve a whole bunch of different kinds of people, instead of realizing, wait, everybody who lives in like this 10 block area kind of cares about this stuff. And if you go over on the other side of some street, they're going to care about a different set of things. And so, and the church needs to be aware of that. So anyway, that was sort of a theory to begin with, but I just thought Urban Islands, that's a pretty good name, pretty fun, so let's go with that. We called it that. We moved into Denver. We chose Denver for a bunch of different reasons, but anyway, we moved into the downtown, to the heart of Denver. I'm in the shadow of the skyscrapers they call it a first ring neighborhood right outside of the central business district. And we have all the stuff that you hear about. If you're not an urban person, you hear about, the gunshots and the drugs and the homeless and all this stuff. It's all right here. We live in the middle of that. Rich and poor live right next to together. That whole thing, it's just all the urban stuff. So anyway, I felt like for me to have credibility with urban people, I had to be urban myself. That was 10 years ago. So I think I'm a legit urban person now. I really understand living in the urban. But the other thing I wanted to figure out was, how do you start churches? And the only way I knew to do it is just let's just do the best we can with what we know and get some people to be willing. So my original idea was, let's start with 10 churches in the same city at the same time, like in different neighborhoods. Like we felt like we needed to focus on the neighborhoods, not on the big city, but just on the neighborhoods as like little islands, that we would start a church for each island. So our goal was to get 10. We got 7 church planning teams to come into 7 different neighborhoods of Denver and start basically at the same time 7 different churches in these 7 different neighborhoods. And it was fascinating, the stuff we learned. And that's actually what led to the book Next Wave, which we'll talk about in a minute. But anyway, long story short, we went on to, I thought, this isn't going to work if I have to live in the city, every city, I can't do it. So, because I wanted to scale up faster than one person could do it. So we said, let's try to do it in some other cities where we don't live. So we did it in Minneapolis, St. Paul. We did it in New York City. We did it in Nashville. And each place we started clusters of churches in the same city at the same time in different neighborhoods. And from that is where we discovered the principles of Next Wave, the 21st century church.
So transition there, because I'm really curious about some of the analytics you've uncovered, some of the trends and lessons that you've learned here.
Yeah, yeah. So what? First of all, the big thing we figured out was cities, the city center especially. There's something about the collective of creatives and movers and shakers that happen around a city that makes cities kind of natural cultural shapers. They're
Hmm.
cultural architects.
Hmm.
Cities collectively, the people who live in cities are the collective architects of culture. And so like whenever people think about American culture, it's kind of being born in the cities. That's where it's being born, and then it's exported out through the different. It happens faster than ever because of
Yeah.
stuff like this,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it starts in the city. So anyway, we figured out, wait, if we can figure out what are the principles that lead to success in the city, that's going to be helpful to everybody. And we realize what's happening is the city is transitioning from a 20th century culture to a 21st century culture. And here's some of the principles, like for the church specifically, but I think it applies to, any endeavor. Really, you need to understand. One of them is, for a church to be effective in a city, they've got to be willing to diversify their revenue stream plan. And in other words, most churches start with the idea that the way that the church is going to be supported is through the giving of the people who attend the church. And that's been the gold standard of how churches are supported. The problem with in a city, if you go into an underserved community, it's really hard for the income level of the folks that are living in that community to be enough to support a full-time leader and a building and all the stuff you need for quote unquote a church to exist. But it's also a problem on the other end of the scale, in the more upscale places. Just finding a place to meet that's affordable is
Yeah.
crazy.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
one church we worked with, it wasn't one of the ones we were helping to start, but they reached out to us and said, "Hey, help us figure this out." They were spending, not making this up, $4,000 a week to rent
Oh.
a performance venue in
Yep.
the neighborhood they wanted to be. It was the only place they could gather, and it would only handle about 150 people at the most. And so you do the math. I mean, it was 4,000 a week just for 3 hours to use
Wow.
the space for 3 hours, and they had to get in, do their thing, get out, clean it up when they left every week. It was just insane. Well, that church barely made it a year in that venue. They had to move to a different space, and they just never got the momentum they needed. So anyway, there's an economic problem. Now, they were trying to do it based on this old idea that you have to have your money comes from people that are attending the church, and the math just would never work. With 150 people, you could not come up with enough money, even if they were all very wealthy, to cover the cost of
Yeah.
the church. And that,
Yeah.
well, you have to have diversified revenue streams, which means things like co-vocational. In other words, the leader, the pastors, the staff, everybody has to bring themselves somewhat. They have to have a side gig or something to support themselves. You have to do partnerships with nonprofits, partnerships with for-profits. Like, my favorite story of a partnership with a for-profit is where this guy wanted to start a church in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, I cannot." He said, "I want to start a church in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but I cannot figure out the ROI." Well, most church planners don't use that language. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I bet the answer to your question is in your story. What's your story? He says, "Well, I grew up in the nation of Venezuela. I became a professional dancer. I
Wow.
a dance studio, and I ended up owning a chain of dance studios across the nation of Venezuela." And I said, here's your answer. I said, "Do you know how to start a dance?"
There it is.
He said, "Yes, see." I said, do, what are you waiting for? And he goes, "Oh my goodness." And so he started One Reason Dance Studio. And then 6 months later, he started One Reason Church. And
That's awesome.
that created a revenue stream that
Yeah.
provided the building for them. And then he was able to get money from other places. But that's just, I mean, there's a billion examples of that. So that's
Yeah.
a big key thing for the future. And I think even, when you think about businesses and stuff like that, everybody has to be more fleet of foot than we ever
Yes.
used to be.
Yeah.
Everything keeps changing so rapidly. You can't just get stuck somewhere.
Well, COVID, right? The little word. It's only 5 letters.
Yeah.
I write it now with a small c, just not to
Yeah.
give it the respect that it may deserve. I don't know, but
Yeah.
do you think attendance is going to come back? I mean, you visited us in Boston and in
Yep.
Canton, Massachusetts, and
Yeah.
we've noticed that those that call it home still it hasn't changed much.
Right.
Up and down a little bit, but hasn't changed a lot. People that come on a Sunday has in
Yes.
favor of online.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, COVID was definitely, I think I've heard someone else say this, but I'm saying it now like I said it.
Yeah,
So, but I think somebody else said this first, and that is COVID really exposed some problems the church
I
was
saw
not
that in your
dealing with.
summary. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And so I think that COVID it accelerated the awareness that we all have of, whoa, we got to make some changes here. So I don't think that now here's, if you look at what's actually happening right now, and again, this is way oversimplifying, but the
Yep.
big trend is the big churches are gaining during following COVID. A lot of people who left their churches during COVID are going back to larger churches.
Mm.
Um,
Define large.
well, I mean, it depends on where you're at.
Yeah,
In Utah,
yeah,
large is 500. You know, in Texas, large is 20,000.
yeah,
You know,
yeah. Right, right.
but anyway, the point is they're going to churches that can kind of provide the full uh, expectation of what they have as church goers, and
Nursery,
so
childcare,
yeah, all that
education.
stuff.
Yeah,
And so, and so in that sense, you know, people are becoming more consumeristic maybe than ever before. You know, they got kicked out, and they don't want to. They're but then at the other end of the spectrum, what's interesting is, so you have the bigger churches are getting bigger, but there's more smaller churches popping up all over the place, because what's happened is there's been a wave of, you call them what you want, non-traditional, unconventional kinds of church, like, well, the dance church is
right,
the example I gave you just now.
right.
But there's coffee house churches, there's dinner churches, there's micro churches, there's networks of churches like the Tampa Underground and the KC Underground that are meeting in people's homes and stuff like that. And so in some ways you've got the church is kind of going in two different directions. One is really more like performance oriented, and the quality is what people are looking for. The other one is more experience oriented, incarnational oriented. Neither, I'm not, I think both are right, both are fine, but what's happening is the churches in the middle are struggling. The churches, the middle size, say 200 to 500,
Right.
that used to be sort of the bread and butter of the church. It's becoming less so. They're either, people are leaving those churches because they're not quite good enough for the consumers, and they're too churchy for the people who long for something more organic and incarnational and stuff like that. And so there's a
Interesting.
struggle. So those churches are where people are not coming back to, is those middle ground churches. Is, again, way oversimplification, but that's kind of the big picture right now.
Tough question. Not sure you can answer. Do your best. What advice would you have for that middle church team?
Oh, I think the answer for them is, I would say if they're on the cusp of being a church that can really be kind of a regional church that's going to attract people from all over, then figure out
Yeah.
it takes to get over that hump. But for most churches in that range, I would encourage them to pivot to more of a strategy of, how can we start more I call them artesian churches. I call them, like, how can we find leaders within our congregation that have an itch about something? Again, maybe it's the
Mm.
guy,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, that always has wanted to have a coffee shop or something. Okay, well, let's go out and do the research. What's it going to take? Is there a need for a coffee shop? And then start a coffee shop and a church and resource that. So I just think the churches in the middle are going to have to go one direction or the other. And so my advice would be, figure out which way makes the most sense for you. And honestly, the great thing about the more organic, incarnational forms of church is there's less financial risk in that direction. You know, to go to
Yeah.
the big,
Yeah.
you're gonna have to. It's almost like, you know, starting a big company or something. You've got to come up with lots of capital, and
Mhm.
everything's got to be just right. That the margin for error is very, very small in that approach. Whereas starting experiments in the other direction, which is actually, this is what the Reimagined Church is about. The book that we're just writing is helping churches think about, how do we reimagine ourselves and start these little spin-off things, and yet they're connected. They're not just out there completely isolated, but they're connected. I think that's where things are going to trend, and that's where things are going to go.
So we've got about 5 minutes. I want to touch on the 12 shifts necessary for, you
Yeah.
say, for every 21st century church leader. And I'm going to touch on a few. Feel free to jump in and mention one I may not. Reimagine discipleship. I got it. I was really taken by that one.
Yeah. So people, when they think of discipleship, they think about helping people who are already following Jesus follow him better. Grow in Jesus, grow in their faith, that kind of stuff. That's become the definition of discipleship. But if you look at the biblical picture of disciple making, Jesus went out and he said to these guys fishing, he said, "I want you guys to follow me. Just come with me." Tax collector. Those guys were not well thought of because they were actually colluding with the Romans to rip off their fellow Jewish family and friends, so they were not thought. He invited him to come. And so there's a question I like to ask people is, when did the disciples become Christians? And, most people go, "Oh, that's it." Yeah. And the answer is, it's hard to tell because there isn't a place in the story in any of the Gospels where it clearly says, and at this point they prayed the sinner's prayer, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And so the reality is making disciples starts with you interacting with somebody who's not yet following Jesus and helping them move toward Jesus. And that's what reimagining discipleship is about, is thinking about it. I call it broadband disciple making, helping people move toward Jesus, helping people grow with Jesus. We're called to do both of those. And that means we can make disciples of everybody in our life somehow, some shape.
All right. What about rethinking team building?
Yeah. So one of the challenges, again, this is in the context of starting new churches. Typically, what the 20th century church plant was, let's get a really excellent worship leader and a really excellent youth pastor. So they would build a team out of position players who were like experts in different things that the proclamational church needed, the traditional church needed to be attractive to people. Well, what we're suggesting is, if the disciple making, Jesus actually never said to make or to start churches. He said to make disciples. So if disciples is what we're called to do, then what you actually want to start a church with is people who are just, as they do life, they're making disciples of people around them. And so that's the rethinking team building. Instead of going out and finding the best position players, you go out and find people who are disciple makers as they do life, and invite them onto your team so that community of disciples can grow.
So really relational in their heart.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. And that's the contrast, because a lot of times, like, the worship leaders holed up somewhere, singing songs to themselves. In the green room. but you want people who are out there, connecting. Yep.
All right. Last one we have time for. We talked about this just slightly, but refresh the metrics.
Yeah. So the big thing, most churches, when people say, "Hey, how's it going?" "Oh, good." In fact, I've been saying this all day. We ran this many. We ran 200, 500,000, 2,000, whatever. We identify the church by how many people show up on Sunday to hear the pastor preach. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it. And that's the metric you use. Well, the problem with that metric is, it's almost, I compare that to you being in a car. It's going 80 miles an hour because the only two gauges that you can see are how fast are we going and how much gas is in the tank. The speedometer says we're going 80. The gas tank says it's full. Sounds like everything's great. But the rest of the story is, you're going downhill, you have no brakes, and you're headed for a cliff. Okay. Those two gauges are not giving you all the information you need to know if that car is healthy or not. The engine fell out. You're going 80 miles an hour, but it has no engine. So my point is, just saying, well, we have 2,000 people doesn't mean it's a healthy church.
Yeah.
So we have to have other metrics. And so some of those would be what we just talked about, like how many disciples are being made is one question. We actually had one of our churches here in Denver. They started measuring their effectiveness by how many keys to their neighbors' homes they had, because the neighbors had given them their key because they trusted them. Yes. Yeah. And that was actually a tangible expression of trust. And they said, we want that to be how we're known in this community, in this neighborhood. So that's an example of a different kind of metric.
There is so much more. I wish we had time. It's been really awesome having you here, Steve. Thank you so much. I know you're really busy. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kevin. This has been an honor.
Juan, if you'd put on the crawl one more time, hope people can reach out. The new book comes out when?
That's a good question. Imminently. It'll probably be within. They haven't given us a date yet, but it's going to be out in the next couple of months here.
Cool. And they can purchase the older books or I hate to say the older books, the first books
at
nextwave.community.
Yeah,
nextwave.community.
Or you can go to Amazon and all that. Yeah.
Okay.
It's available there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thanks everybody for watching and for listening. This is a show about business and business challenges, a little different spin today, but hope you see the parallels. If you've got concerns about the growth of your company, feel free to reach out to me on Facebook or LinkedIn at Winning Business Radio, or you can drop me a note. One of my many email addresses is kevin@winningbusinessradio.com. Our company is Winning Incorporated. We're part of Sandler Training. We develop sales teams into high achievers and sales leaders into true coaches and mentors. Listen, we're not right for everybody, but hey, maybe we should have a conversation. Thank you to producer and engineer Juan. Appreciate you, Juan, for another job well done. Be sure to join us next week. That's Monday, July 15th. We're going to do it all over again. Until then, this is Kevin Hallinan. Thank you.
You've been listening to Winning Business Radio with your host, Kevin Hallinan. If you missed any part of this episode, the podcast is available on Talk4 Podcasting and iHeartRadio. For more information and questions, go to winningbusinessradio.com or check us out on social media. Tune in again next week and every Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time to listen live to Winning Business Radio on W4CY Radio, W4CY.com. Until then, let's succeed where others have failed and win in business with Kevin Hallinan and Winning Business Radio.